the mixed-breed dog that would become known as Sinbad and would eventually achieve the rank of Chief Petty Officer in the United States Coast Guard, first came aboard the cutter USCGC Campbell in 1937 when he was approximately 1 year old, wandering onto the ship while she was moored in New York Harbor, and immediately making himself at home among the crew who welcomed the Scruffy mutt as an unofficial mascot, and who had no idea that this seemingly ordinary dog would serve aboard the Campbell for 11 years, including the entire duration of World War II, and would participate in some of the most savage convoy battles of the Atlantic Campaign, while becoming one of the most famous and most decorated animals in American military history, earning more medals and citations than many human sailors received during their entire careers, and capturing the public imagination through newspaper articles and newsreel footage that portrayed him as the embodiment of canine loyalty and courage under fire. Sinbad was a medium-sized dog of indeterminate breeding, who appeared to be primarily terrier, with possible contributions from several other breeds that gave him a distinctly mongrel appearance that his crew found endearing rather than off-putting. And he weighed approximately 40 pounds and stood about 18 inches at the shoulder, with wiry brown and white fur that was perpetually disheveled despite the crew's occasional attempts to groom him into something resembling a properly maintained military working dog, rather than the scruffy stray that he had been when he first appeared on the Campbell's deck. The Campbell was a Treasury-class cutter that had been commissioned in 1936 as part of the Coast Guard's modernization program that aimed to replace older vessels with ships that incorporated the latest technology and design features, including diesel-electric propulsion that was more efficient and reliable than the steam engines that had powered earlier Coast Guard cutters, and the ship displaced 327 feet in length and displaced 2,200 tons at full load, mounting a primary armament of 5-inch guns plus numerous smaller caliber anti-aircraft weapons and depth charge racks that would prove essential during the convoy battles of World War II, when German submarines posed a constant threat to Allied shipping crossing the Atlantic between North America and Great Britain. The Campbell's primary peacetime mission had been law enforcement and search and rescue operations along the East Coast, where the Coast Guard maintained a continuous presence to combat smuggling and to respond to maritime emergencies that ranged from fishing boats in distress to passenger ships requiring assistance. And during these peacetime operations, Sinbad established himself as an integral member of the crew who participated in daily routines and who developed such strong bonds with the sailors aboard the Campbell that they came to regard him not as a pet or mascot, but as a genuine shipmate who shared the hardships and dangers of life at sea, and who deserved recognition and respect accordingly. Sinbad's daily routine aboard the Campbell during peacetime operations included accompanying the crew during their various duties throughout the ship, following sailors as they performed maintenance work and standing watches and conducting drills. And the dog developed an uncanny ability to anticipate the ship's routine and to position himself wherever the action was most interesting at any given moment, whether that meant watching the cooks prepare meals in the galley or observing the engineering crew working on the diesel engines, or accompanying deck parties as they painted and cleaned and maintained the ship's external surfaces. The relationship between Sinbad and the Campbell's cooks deserves particular attention, because the dog quickly learned that the galley was one of the most important locations aboard the ship, and that cultivating friendships with the men who controlled the food supply would ensure that he never went hungry. despite the fact that official Navy regulations did not provide for feeding animals aboard vessels, and despite the fact that wartime rationing meant that food supplies were carefully controlled and accounted for with minimal waste tolerated. The cooks adopted Sinbad as their unofficial mascot within the larger ship's company, and they prepared special meals for him that often included scraps of meat and other delicacies that were not available to the regular crew. And this preferential treatment occasionally caused minor friction between the cooks and other sailors who joked that Sinbad ate better than they did, and who suggested half-seriously that they should try to trade duties with the dog if it meant getting access to the same quality of food. The galley crew responded to these complaints by pointing out that Sinbad earned his meals by providing valuable services, including pest control, because his presence discouraged rats and mice from establishing themselves in the food storage areas, and by serving as an early warning system for problems, because the dog's acute sense of smell allowed him to detect food that was beginning to spoil before humans would notice anything wrong, and before the spoiled food could make crew members sick. Sinbad's sleeping arrangements aboard the Campbell evolved over the years from simply finding comfortable spots wherever he could to having an official berthing space that was designated on the ship's deck plans, and which was fitted out with a custom-made bunk that was appropriately sized for a 40-pound dog, and which included bedding that was laundered regularly along with the crew's linens. And this official recognition of Sinbad's need for proper accommodations reflected the crew's genuine concern for his welfare and their determination to ensure that he was as comfortable as possible, given the inherent limitations of life aboard a warship where space was at a premium and where even human crew members often had to make do with cramped berthing areas that provided minimal privacy and minimal comfort. The location of Sinbad's bunk changed several times during his service aboard the Campbell, as the ship underwent various modifications and as different crew members took responsibility for his care, but it was typically located near the chief petty officer's quarters in recognition of his eventual rank and in acknowledgement that he had earned the right to bunk with the senior enlisted personnel rather than with the junior sailors who occupied the more crowded and less comfortable berthing spaces in the forward part of the ship. The crew taught Sinbad various tricks and commands, including sitting and lying down on command, and shaking hands with sailors who extended their paws in greeting. And these performances became popular entertainment during the long periods at sea when the crew had limited recreational options, and when even simple diversions, like watching a dog perform tricks, could provide welcome relief from the monotony of routine operations. Sinbad's repertoire of tricks expanded over the years to include more complex behaviors, including playing dead when someone pointed their finger at him and said bang, and rolling over on command, and retrieving objects that crew members threw across the deck. And these tricks were taught through patient repetition and positive reinforcement using food treats that the cooks provided specifically for training purposes. And the training sessions themselves became social events where off-duty sailors would gather to watch and to offer advice and to place small bets on whether Sinbad would successfully perform whatever trick was being attempted. The dog's ability to learn and perform these tricks impressed sailors who had no previous experience training dogs and who were surprised by how quickly Sinbad could master new behaviors if the training was conducted properly and if appropriate rewards were provided. And several crew members who worked with Sinbad during his training went on to keep dogs as pets after the war ended, and they returned to civilian life, applying the training techniques they had learned aboard the Campbell to their own animals, and discovering that the patience and consistency that had worked with Sinbad produced similar results with other dogs, regardless of breed or background. Sinbad also developed a reputation for being an excellent judge of character, who could apparently sense when strangers aboard the ship were trustworthy or suspicious, and sailors reported numerous occasions when Sinbad's behavior toward visitors or new crew members proved to be an accurate predictor of how those individuals would eventually fit into the Campbell's community, with the dog showing immediate friendship toward people who would become valued members of the crew, while maintaining distance from individuals who would later prove problematic or who would fail to adapt successfully to the demands of life aboard a Coast Guard cutter. When World War II began in September 1939, the Campbell continued her peacetime operations because the United States remained officially neutral during the first 2 years of the European War. But the ship's mission gradually shifted toward more military-focused activities as President Roosevelt implemented policies, including the Lend-Lease program, that provided material support to Britain, and as American ships began conducting neutrality patrols that monitored belligerent naval forces and protected American merchant vessels from interference by warships from nations that were at war. Sinbad remained aboard throughout these changes, and the crew made no attempt to put him ashore, even though regulations technically prohibited animals aboard Coast Guard vessels, except for working animals like dogs trained for specific duties such as detecting contraband or performing search and rescue operations. And the Campbell's commanding officers during this period chose to overlook these regulations because Sinbad had become such an integral part of the ship's culture, and because removing him would have seriously damaged crew morale at a time when maintaining high spirits was essential, given the increasing dangers that the ship and her crew were facing as American involvement in the European conflict deepened despite official neutrality. After the United States entered World War II in December 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Campbell was assigned to convoy escort duties in the North Atlantic, where German submarines were conducting a devastating campaign against Allied shipping that threatened to sever the maritime supply lines between North America and Britain, and which posed an existential threat to Britain's ability to continue fighting, because the island nation depended absolutely on imported food and fuel and raw materials that could only be delivered by merchant ships running the submarine gauntlet across thousands of miles of open ocean, where German U-boats hunted in wolf packs and where a single submarine could sink multiple ships during a single patrol if it could penetrate the defensive screen of destroyers and corvettes and Coast Guard cutters that escorted the slow-moving merchant convoys. The typical convoy operation lasted between 10 and 14 days, depending on weather conditions and on whether the convoy encountered enemy action that slowed its progress or forced it to take evasive routes that added hundreds of miles to the transit. And during these operations, the Campbell and other escort vessels maintained continuous watch using radar and sonar to detect submarines and using visual lookouts to spot periscopes or torpedo wakes or any other sign that might indicate enemy presence in the vicinity of the convoy. The crews aboard escort vessels worked in 4-hour watches around the clock, with sailors rotating through various duty stations, including bridge watch, where they served as lookouts and as assistant officers of the deck, and sonar watch, where they monitored the temperamental sonar equipment that could detect submerged submarines, but which required skilled operators who could distinguish between genuine contacts and false returns caused by thermal layers or schools of fish or underwater terrain features, and gun stations where they maintained the weapons that would be used to engage surfaced submarines or to defend against air attacks if German long-range aircraft located the convoy and attempted to attack merchant vessels or escort ships. Sinbad's behavior during convoy operations showed remarkable adaptation to the stress and danger of wartime conditions, because the dog seemed to understand that the ship was engaged in serious business and that the playful routines of peacetime operations were no longer appropriate. And sailors reported that during convoy operations, Sinbad spent more time resting quietly in his designated spaces and less time wandering around the ship seeking entertainment or attention from the crew, who were focused on their duties and who had less time and energy for interacting with the ship's dog than they had during peacetime, when watches were less demanding and when there was not the constant underlying tension that characterized wartime operations, where death could come at any moment from a torpedo that might strike without warning and send the ship to the bottom in minutes. The dog's ability to sense the crew's mood and to moderate his own behavior accordingly reinforced the sailors' belief that Sinbad possessed an almost human level of understanding and empathy, and numerous crew members recorded in letters and diaries their conviction that the dog was aware of the dangers they faced and that he was deliberately trying to avoid causing additional stress or distraction for men who were already operating at the limits of their physical and psychological endurance. One particularly harrowing incident occurred during convoy on 154 in December 1942, when the Campbell and other escorts fought a running battle with a wolf pack of German submarines that sank 13 merchant ships over the course of 4 days, while the escorts struggled to protect the remaining vessels and to hunt down and destroy the submarines that were attacking with coordinated tactics that overwhelmed the escort force's ability to respond effectively. And during this battle, Sinbad remained on deck for extended periods, despite the danger from exploding depth charges and from the possibility that the Campbell herself might be torpedoed at any moment. And sailors who were manning gun stations or damage control posts reported seeing the dog standing near the bridge, apparently watching the battle unfold, and seemingly understanding that his presence provided comfort and reassurance to crew members who drew strength from the dog's calm demeanor, even as merchant ships were burning and sinking around them. And as the escorts launched depth charge attacks that created enormous underwater explosions that could be felt throughout the Campbell's hull, and which sometimes brought stunned or dead fish floating to the surface as collateral damage from the anti-submarine warfare that was being conducted with desperate intensity. The psychological impact of convoy operations on escort crews was severe, because these sailors witnessed terrible suffering and death without being able to do much to prevent it or to mitigate its effects, watching through binoculars as torpedoed merchant ships broke apart and sank while survivors struggled in the frigid water, and while the escorts had to choose between stopping to rescue survivors and thereby making themselves vulnerable to additional attacks, or continuing to screen the remaining merchant vessels and leaving the survivors to their fate in water that would kill them through hypothermia within 15 or 20 minutes, even if they were wearing life jackets, and even if they avoided the oil fires that often erupted when tankers were hit and spilled their cargoes into the sea, where the burning petroleum created infernos that consumed anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in the flames. The moral injury that resulted from these impossible choices affected many escort sailors for the rest of their lives, creating psychological wounds that were not well understood during World War II, and which were not treated with any kind of systematic therapy or counseling, because the psychiatric understanding of combat trauma was still primitive, and because military medicine focused primarily on physical injuries rather than on the psychological damage that resulted from prolonged exposure to combat stress and moral ambiguity. The Campbell participated in dozens of convoy operations during 1942 and 1943, shepherding merchant ships across the Atlantic while conducting continuous anti-submarine patrols that involved maintaining sonar watch around the clock and launching depth charge attacks against suspected submarine contacts and coordinating with other escort vessels and with long-range patrol aircraft to locate and destroy German submarines before they could attack the vulnerable merchant vessels that were carrying the supplies and equipment that Allied forces needed to conduct offensive operations in North Africa and eventually in Europe itself. Sinbad accompanied the Campbell on all these convoy operations, and he became a familiar sight to sailors throughout the escort force because the dog could often be seen standing on the Campbell's deck during convoy operations, apparently watching for submarines or aircraft, just as the human lookouts were doing, and his presence aboard the ship became something of a legend throughout the Atlantic convoy community, where sailors on other ships knew about the Coast Guard cutter that carried a dog who had his own berthing space and his own mess privileges, and who was treated by the crew as a genuine member of the ship's company rather than as a mascot or pet. The crew had fashioned a small life jacket for Sinbad that he wore during general quarters when the ship was at battle stations and when there was heightened risk of attack, and photographs of Sinbad wearing his tiny life jacket became popular in newspapers back home, where the public was eager for stories that humanized the war and which showed that even in the midst of deadly combat, sailors could maintain bonds with animals and could find moments of warmth and humor, despite the constant danger and stress that characterized life aboard convoy escorts operating in the North Atlantic, where weather conditions alone were sufficient to kill sailors, even without any intervention from German submarines or aircraft. The Campbell's most famous action occurred on February 27, 1943, during convoy on 166, when the cutter engaged and sank the German submarine U-606 after a prolonged battle that began when the Campbell's sonar operators detected a submarine contact and tracked it through multiple evasive maneuvers before the cutter was able to maneuver into position for a depth charge attack that damaged the submarine and forced it to surface where the Campbell's guns could engage it directly. The surface engagement lasted only a few minutes, but was extraordinarily violent as the Campbell's 5-inch gun and smaller caliber weapons poured fire into the surface submarine at point-blank range, while German sailors attempted to man their deck gun and return fire before being cut down by the American gunfire that was sweeping the submarine's conning tower and deck, and the U-606 sank stern first after her crew abandoned ship and left approximately 40 German sailors struggling in the frigid North Atlantic water, where they would die from hypothermia within minutes if they were not rescued immediately by the Campbell or by other escort vessels that were converging on the scene. The Campbell immediately began rescue operations, despite the obvious danger of stopping in waters where other German submarines might be operating, and where the cutter would be vulnerable to torpedo attack while she was dead in the water picking up survivors. And during the next 30 minutes, the Campbell's crew pulled 15 German sailors from the water, including the U-606's commanding officer, who was badly wounded and who died shortly after being brought aboard, despite the best efforts of the Campbell's medical personnel to save him. Sinbad was present on deck during these rescue operations, and several sailors reported that the dog showed surprising gentleness toward the German survivors who were being brought aboard, approaching them cautiously but without aggression, and apparently understanding that these bedraggled and hypothermic men were no longer enemies, but were fellow sailors who needed help, and this behavior reinforced the crew's belief that Sinbad possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand complex situations and to respond appropriately even without any formal training or instruction about how a ship's dog should behave during combat operations. The action against U-606 earned the Campbell a Presidential Unit citation that recognized the entire crew for their performance during the engagement, and Sinbad was specifically mentioned in the citation as having maintained morale during the battle and having demonstrated the courage and loyalty that were characteristic of the best traditions of naval service. And this official recognition transformed Sinbad from an unofficial mascot into a genuinely decorated military working dog, whose service was formally acknowledged by the highest levels of the American government. The crew capitalized on this recognition by arranging for Sinbad to receive a series of promotions through the enlisted ranks, starting with seaman and progressing through petty officer 3rd class and 2nd class and 1st class, until he eventually achieved the rank of Chief Petty Officer in 1944, a rank that was only slightly below that of the most junior commissioned officers and which placed Sinbad in the upper echelons of the ship's enlisted hierarchy, where he theoretically outranked more than half the human crew, though in practice the rank was purely ceremonial, and Sinbad continued living and working aboard the ship exactly as he had before his promotions. The promotions were accompanied by elaborate ceremonies that involved the entire crew and which included the fabrication of a tiny uniform that incorporated appropriate rank insignia and which Sinbad wore during formal occasions, including ship inspections and ceremonies where visiting dignitaries came aboard the Campbell and were introduced to the famous dog who had become something of a celebrity in Coast Guard circles and beyond, with his story being covered in national newspapers and magazines that portrayed him as an example of American pluck and determination, and which suggested that even dogs could contribute to the war effort if they possessed the right spirit and if they were given the opportunity to serve. The media coverage of Sinbad's story began modestly, with local newspaper articles in ports where the Campbell docked and where reporters looking for human interest stories learned about the ship's unusual mascot and wrote features that described his daily routine and his relationship with the crew. But this coverage expanded dramatically after the Campbell's action against U-606 in February 1943, when National Wire Services picked up the story and distributed it to newspapers across the country, where editors recognized that readers were eager for uplifting stories about the war that focused on heroism and loyalty rather than on casualties and defeats. The photographs of Sinbad wearing his miniature uniform and standing alongside sailors became iconic images that were reproduced in dozens of publications and which were used in recruiting posters and in Coast Guard publicity materials that emphasized the service's contribution to the war effort and which highlighted the human dimension of military service through stories about men and animals working together to defeat the Axis powers. The Public Relations Office of the Coast Guard headquarters in Washington recognized the value of Sinbad's story for building public support for the service and for maintaining morale among Coast Guard personnel, who sometimes felt that their contributions were overshadowed by the more dramatic operations of the Navy and the Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater, where carrier battles and amphibious assaults dominated news coverage. And Coast Guard publicists worked with the Campbell's command to arrange for Sinbad to participate in war bond drives and other public events when the ship was in port for maintenance or repairs. These appearances typically involved Sinbad being photographed with local dignitaries and with civilians who purchased war bonds, and the dog would perform his tricks for audiences who were charmed by the sight of a military dog who could shake hands and play dead and roll over on command. And these performances generated significant publicity and contributed to war bond sales that exceeded quotas in several cities where Sinbad appeared. The logistics of arranging these public appearances created additional work for the Campbell's crew because the dog had to be transported to various locations and because someone had to accompany him and ensure that he was properly cared for and that he performed appropriately during the events, and these duties typically fell to one or more of the sailors who had been most closely involved with Sinbad's care and training aboard the ship, and who understood his personality and his quirks, and who could handle him effectively in unfamiliar environments where the crowds and noise might otherwise have been overwhelming. The sailors who accompanied Sinbad on these public relations missions found that they became minor celebrities themselves, as reporters and photographers sought quotes and background information about the famous dog. And these sailors discovered that their association with Sinbad opened doors and created opportunities for social interaction that would not otherwise have been available to enlisted men whose status in civilian society was relatively low despite their military service and despite the dangers they faced during convoy operations. The phenomenon of Sinbad's celebrity raised interesting questions about the nature of military service and about how the public understood and valued different types of contributions to the war effort, because there was something slightly absurd about the fact that a dog could become more famous and more widely recognized than the thousands of human sailors who were performing identical duties aboard other escort vessels, without receiving any public recognition or acknowledgement beyond the satisfaction of knowing that they were doing their jobs and contributing to the war effort in ways that were essential but not glamorous or newsworthy. Some sailors resented the attention that Sinbad received and felt that the media coverage distorted the reality of convoy operations by focusing on a heartwarming animal story, rather than on the grim realities of anti-submarine warfare, where men died terrible deaths and where victories were often measured not by enemies destroyed, but by convoys that arrived safely despite suffering significant losses along the way. But most sailors aboard the Campbell and throughout the Coast Guard recognized that Sinbad's fame benefited everyone in the service by raising public awareness of Coast Guard operations and by generating goodwill that translated into political support and budgetary resources that allowed the Coast Guard to maintain and expand its capabilities during and after the war. The public relations value of Sinbad's story was not lost on Coast Guard leadership, who encouraged the Campbell's crew to continue publicizing their canine shipmate, and who arranged for Sinbad to participate in war bond drives and other morale-building activities when the Campbell was in port. And during these appearances, Sinbad would be photographed with sailors and with civilians who purchased war bonds and who wanted to meet the famous dog whose exploits had made him one of the most recognizable animals in America during the war years. The Campbell suffered severe damage in February 1943 during the same convoy battle where she sank U-6006 when the cutter rammed another German submarine U-753 after detecting it on the surface during a night action, and the collision tore a massive hole in the Campbell's bow and caused flooding that threatened to sink the ship before damage control parties could contain the water ingress and before temporary repairs could be made that would allow the cutter to limp back to port for permanent repairs. Sinbad was aboard during this incident, and sailors reported that the dog remained calm throughout the crisis, despite the violent impact of the collision and despite the chaos aboard the ship as crew members rushed to their damage control stations and began fighting to save the vessel from sinking in the middle of the Atlantic, where rescue would be difficult or impossible, given that all other escort vessels were occupied protecting the merchant convoy and could not break off to assist the crippled Campbell unless the tactical situation permitted. The damage control efforts succeeded in keeping the Campbell afloat long enough for her to reach Newfoundland, where temporary repairs were completed before she transited to New York for permanent repairs that required 3 months of work in a shipyard where workers rebuilt the entire bow section and conducted extensive overhaul of systems that had been damaged or degraded during the months of continuous convoy operations in the harsh North Atlantic environment. Sinbad accompanied the Campbell to the shipyard and remained aboard throughout the repair period, becoming a familiar sight to shipyard workers who would see the dog wandering around the ship or lying in sunny spots on deck, watching the work proceed around him, and workers reported that Sinbad seemed to understand that the ship was being repaired and would occasionally inspect work areas as if checking on progress and ensuring that the repairs were being completed to appropriate standards. The dog's presence during the repair period helped maintain crew morale during a time when many sailors were being temporarily transferred to other ships or sent on leave while the Campbell was out of service, and sailors who remained with the ship to oversee the repairs and to conduct training and to prepare for the return to operational status found that Sinbad provided continuity and a sense of normalcy during what might otherwise have been a difficult period when the tight-knit crew was partially dispersed and when the ship herself was in a state of partial disassembly that bore little resemblance to the operational warship that she had been before the damage from ramming U-753. The Campbell returned to convoy duty in June 1943 after completing repairs and continued operating in the North Atlantic through the remainder of 1943 and into 1944 as the Allies gradually gained the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic through a combination of improved tactics and better technology, including more effective radar and sonar systems and longer-range patrol aircraft that could cover areas of the Atlantic that had previously been beyond the reach of land-based planes and which had therefore been sanctuaries where German submarines could operate with relative impunity. Sinbad participated in all these operations, and his reputation continued to grow as more sailors and officers throughout the Atlantic convoy forces became aware of the Coast Guard dog, who had earned combat decorations and who had been promoted to Chief Petty Officer and who continued serving aboard the Campbell despite being old enough by 1944 that he could have been retired with honor and sent to live ashore where he would have been more comfortable and where he would not have been exposed to the dangers and hardships of continued service aboard a warship operating in combat conditions. The question of whether Sinbad should be retired became a topic of serious discussion among the Campbell's officers during 1944 because the dog was now approximately 8 years old and was beginning to show signs of aging, including some stiffness in his joints that made it more difficult for him to climb the ship's ladders and to move around the vessel with the ease that he had displayed when he was younger, and there were concerns that keeping him aboard might be cruel, given that he was no longer able to fully enjoy the activities that had filled his days during his younger years, and given that he might be more comfortable living ashore where he could rest and relax without being subjected to the constant motion and noise and stress that characterized life aboard a warship. However, the crew unanimously opposed any plan to retire Sinbad because they believed that removing him from the ship would break his spirit and would deprive him of the only life he had known for 7 years, and which he clearly preferred to any alternative that might be offered. And they argued that Sinbad should be allowed to remain aboard the Campbell for as long as he lived, and that when he eventually died, he should be buried at sea with full military honours as befitted his rank and his service record. The Campbell's commanding officer accepted the crew's arguments, and Sinbad remained aboard through the end of World War II in August 1945, though by that time his activities had become more limited, and he spent increasing amounts of time resting in his favoured spots aboard the ship rather than actively following the crew around, as he had done during his younger years. The end of the war brought significant changes to the Campbell and her crew, as the ship transitioned from combat operations to peacetime duties that included search and rescue missions and law enforcement patrols similar to what the cutter had been doing before the war. And many of the sailors who had served aboard during the war years were discharged and returned to civilian life, while new crew members came aboard who had not shared the wartime experiences that had forged such strong bonds between Sinbad and the men who had served with him during the Atlantic convoy battles. Sinbad died on December 30th, 1951, at the age of approximately 15 years, having served aboard the Campbell for 14 years, including 11 years of service, during which he had been carried on the ship's official roster as a member of the crew with the rank of Chief Petty Officer, and his death was mourned by Coast Guard personnel across the service who had heard about the famous dog and who recognized that his passing marked the end of an era when animals could still serve aboard warships as unofficial mascots and companions rather than as specialized working animals with specific assigned duties. The Campbell's crew conducted a full military funeral for Sinbad, including a burial at sea with honors that were normally reserved for senior enlisted personnel, and the ceremony was attended by Coast Guard brass and by veterans who had served aboard the Campbell during World War II and who wanted to pay their final respects to a shipmate who had shared their dangers and hardships and who had earned their respect and affection through years of loyal service. The story of Sinbad the Coast Guard dog resonated with the American public during World War II because it provided a heartwarming counterpoint to the grim realities of naval warfare in the Atlantic, where merchant ships were being sunk at alarming rates and where sailors faced constant danger from submarines and aircraft, and from the savage weather conditions that characterized the North Atlantic during winter months, when storms could be as deadly as enemy action, and where men could die from exposure even if their ships survived attacks. The image of a small dog standing watch alongside human sailors and participating in combat operations and earning military decorations captured imaginations and suggested that even in the midst of total war, there remained room for the kind of human-animal bonds that had existed for thousands of years and which spoke to something fundamental about human nature and about the ways that people form connections with other living creatures, even in the most stressful and dangerous circumstances. The practice of keeping animals aboard warships had ancient roots dating back to the earliest days of maritime history, when ships carried cats to control rodent populations, and when officers sometimes kept dogs or other pets as companions during long voyages that could last months or years, and which imposed severe psychological stress on crews who were isolated from their families and communities for extended periods. And these animals served important functions beyond their nominal roles as pest control or companionship by providing emotional support and by creating a sense of normalcy and domesticity that helped sailors maintain their psychological equilibrium during periods of extreme stress and isolation. The tradition continued into the 20th century, though it became increasingly regulated as naval services developed more formal policies about what kinds of animals could be kept aboard ships and under what circumstances, and by World War II, most navies had policies that theoretically prohibited unofficial mascots, though these policies were often ignored or worked around by crews who valued their animal companions and who were willing to bend or break regulations to keep them aboard. Sinbad represented the peak of this tradition in American naval service because he achieved a level of official recognition that was unprecedented for an animal mascot, being formally carried on the ship's roster and receiving actual promotions through the enlisted ranks rather than purely symbolic gestures that had no official standing. And his service record became part of Coast Guard history and was documented in official records and in countless newspaper articles and magazine stories that were filed during and after World War II. The post-war years saw a gradual decline in the tradition of ship mascots as naval services adopted stricter policies about animals aboard vessels and as public attitudes toward animal welfare evolved to question whether keeping animals aboard warships was ethical given the dangers and hardships that such service imposed on creatures who had no choice about whether to participate in military operations. And by the late 20th century, the practice had largely disappeared from American naval service, though it continued in some other navies, where traditions and regulations were different. The legacy of Sinbad and other animal mascots who served during World War II extends beyond their individual stories to encompass broader questions about the relationship between humans and animals, and about the roles that animals play in military organizations and in society more generally, because these stories reveal something important about human psychology and about the ways that people form emotional attachments and create meaning in their lives even in circumstances that would seem to preclude such concerns. The sailors who served aboard the Campbell during World War II faced extraordinary dangers and experienced traumatic events that would affect many of them for the rest of their lives. And for these men, Sinbad represented a connection to a more innocent and peaceful time when their primary concerns were the ordinary routines of peacetime naval service, rather than the life and death struggles of convoy battles, where mistakes could result in ships being sunk and hundreds of men being killed. And maintaining that connection through Sinbad's continued presence aboard the ship helped these sailors preserve their sense of identity and their sense of connection to the lives they had led before the war, and to which they hoped to return when the fighting finally ended. The specific circumstances that allowed Sinbad to achieve official recognition and formal rank were unique to the Coast Guard during World War II, because the service had a more relaxed and informal culture compared to the Navy, and because Coast Guard leadership understood the value of positive publicity and morale-building stories at a time when the service was fighting for recognition and for resources, and when anything that could raise the Coast Guard's profile in the public consciousness was welcome. and Sinbad's story served these purposes perfectly by demonstrating that Coast Guard personnel were just as courageous and just as deserving of recognition as Navy sailors or Army soldiers or Marines who were fighting in more publicized theaters of the war. The Coast Guard had historically struggled with questions of identity and with its somewhat ambiguous status as a military service that operated under the Treasury Department during peacetime, but which was transferred to Navy control during wartime, and the service's role in convoy operations during World War II provided an opportunity to demonstrate its military capabilities and to establish a combat record that would support arguments for maintaining the Coast Guard as a distinct service with its own traditions and missions, rather than simply absorbing it into the Navy, as some post-war reformers suggested. Sinbad's story also illustrates the importance of morale and unit cohesion in military organizations, because the bonds that formed between the dog and the Campbell's crew were not fundamentally different from the bonds that formed among the crew members themselves, and these relationships were essential to maintaining the ship's effectiveness as a fighting unit during the prolonged periods of stress and danger that characterized convoy operations in the North Atlantic, where crews operated in a state of constant alertness and where the psychological toll of continuous operations could degrade performance if not managed through leadership and through the kinds of informal coping mechanisms that included maintaining mascots and traditions and rituals that provided psychological anchors during periods when normal social structures and support systems were not available. Modern military psychology recognizes the importance of these factors, and studies of unit cohesion and combat effectiveness consistently show that small unit bonds and shared identity are among the most important predictors of how well military units will perform under stress. And the story of Sinbad provides a historical example of how these bonds can form around unexpected focal points, including animals who become integrated into military units and who serve functions that go well beyond their nominal roles. The documentation of Sinbad's service, including photographs and news articles and official citations, provides valuable historical material for understanding daily life aboard Coast Guard vessels during World War II, because most historical accounts of the war focus on major battles and strategic decisions, rather than on the quotidian details of how sailors actually lived and worked and maintained their morale during long periods of tedious routine, punctuated by brief moments of terror when enemy action threatened to destroy their ships and kill them all, and the images of Sinbad wearing his uniform or standing watch or participating in ceremonies provide glimpses into this world that complement official histories and which reveal aspects of wartime experience that would otherwise be lost because they were not considered sufficiently important to document systematically at the time. The informal nature of much of this documentation, with its focus on human interest rather than military significance, means that researchers studying World War II naval operations can use Sinbad's story as an entry point for exploring questions about crew welfare and morale and psychological resilience that are difficult to address using only official military records that focus on tactical and operational matters rather than on the human dimensions of naval service. The physical artifacts associated with Sinbad, including his uniform and his medals and various personal items that were kept by crew members after his death, have become collectible items that appear occasionally in auctions and that are sought by military history enthusiasts and by collectors of World War II memorabilia. And these objects serve as tangible connections to a story that resonates emotionally, even decades after the events occurred, and even for people who have no personal connection to the Coast Guard or to World War II naval operations. The Coast Guard Museum in New London, Connecticut, maintains some Sinbad-related items in its collections and occasionally features them in exhibitions about Coast Guard history during World War II. And these displays typically attract significant public interest because Sinbad's story appeals to visitors who might not otherwise be particularly interested in military history, but who are drawn to stories about animals and about the bonds between humans and animals.